They thought abandoned meant empty. They were wrong. What they pulled out of those cabins wasn't just trash or old furniture, it was proof. Lists, photographs, tally marks, small things that turned silence into evidence of something organized, something human and deliberate. It made people change locks, change towns, change the way they slept. Before we begin, a quick warning. The accounts you're about to hear include stalking, near abduction, and evidence of long-term criminal planning. Names, dates, and precise locations have been changed or withheld. These are first-hand recollections. Where legal or factual clarity was missing, the wording reflects that uncertainty. In these retellings, scenes that originally took place in other buildings have been adapted to abandoned cabins and the woods that surround them, so the stories read from one frame of reference, because a list on a rotting kitchen table or a camera tucked under a loft beam plays the same role, no matter the roof that shelters it. If you like hard, true scares and the kinds of real-life stories that make you check the locks twice, hit subscribe now. There's more like this every week. He told me his name was Matt, but that wasn't the point to him. What he wanted me to understand was the pile on his floor and the way his chest tightened when he said the word roster. It begins ordinarily. He meets Leah at a bar one winter. She is kind, funny, the kind of person who remembers the silly details, how he took his coffee, what band he had liked when he was 16. They text for weeks. She shows up unannounced, sometimes at his apartment. Sometimes she leaves, sometimes she stays. He tells himself it's the thrill of a new connection. Then, late one night, a photo shows up on his phone, a grainy Polaroid of his front door, taken from across the street. Someone had angled the camera so the number on the mailbox was visible. The caption? Nothing, just the date. He laughs it off at first. People take dumb pictures, he thinks. But the next day, there's a paper clipping slid under his door, an old newsprint article about a group allegedly involved in luring people to isolated places. The woman's name isn't written there. The story doesn't say Leah. Yet when he puts the clipping beside the Polaroid, he remembers a detail. The necklace she always wore, a tiny silver bird, the same that hangs on the woman in the article's photograph. Curiosity kills. Curiosity, in this case, pushes him deeper into a thicket of fear. One night, after she doesn't answer, he follows the pattern of addresses in the messages she'd sent and finds himself parked at the edge of a clearing. There's a ruined cabin half hidden by brush, its windows blind with grime. He approaches on reflex, and because he wants proof. The door gives under pressure. The smell hits first, stale wood, damp, and iron tang as if something metallic had been stored there for a long time. He sweeps his flashlight left and right. On a rotting table are stacks of photographs, clipped and labeled. Faces, names, postcards crudely torn to show addresses. Beside them, laminated sheets with columns of dates and initials. There are also Polaroids, close-ups of doorways, of front porches. Someone has traced circles around parts of certain pictures. He says he wants to throw up when he sees the binder. He flips it open. There were pages, rows upon rows, like a manual. Targets, times, notes. A phone number scrawled in a handwriting he later learns matches a number that had called him at 2 in the morning with silence on the line. Panic rearranges everything in that moment. He photographs his evidence. He backs out the same way he came in, and his hands are jittery when he dials the police. When the officers arrive, they take photos. They put evidence bags over pages. He is told, according to what he remembers later, that the material would be investigated. He moves out within the month. Locks are changed. He sleeps with his phone on the pillow. Afterward, he cannot unwind the feeling that someone once laid plans using his name like a chess piece. He starts changing social patterns. No bars late at night. No walking home alone. He sleeps with a lamp on. On the worst nights, when the house is quiet and the wind is thin, he swears he hears the prickle of footsteps outside. He told the story to a counselor once, and the word they used was hypervigilance. The binder in the cabin didn't need to be open for him to feel watched. The knowledge that a list had existed, that someone had taken the time to paper the faces and addresses into columns, altered the geometry of safety around him. That binder, according to him, was the first thing that made the idea of an abandoned cabin feel like a trap instead of a relic. It was the moment when dust became deliberate, when neglect turned into a storage closet for schemes. But that was only the beginning. She was supposed to be graduating that summer. She had a scholarship, a few good friends, and a part-time job, and she agreed to take a home interview because it seemed quick and simple. A man who owned a remote rental wanted to meet candidates for a small caretaker position. It would be in a cabin, he said, quiet surroundings, a chance to get away and focus. She took the drive because it paid well, and because the word caretaker felt decent and practical.
The cabin looked better from the road than the photos. A porch with a swing, a well-kept lawn fading into pines. He greeted her with a warm voice and a cup of bottom soda already cooled on a table. He seemed to be waiting. Inside, a camera tripod sits near the kitchen. She notices it in a way people notice a missing tooth. They register the gap, and then a sensation of wrongness spreads. The tripod looks freshly used, fingerprints in the dust, a smear against the rubber handle. She asks about it. He laughs, says he shoots landscapes, says the woods are great for stills at dawn.
He narrates the job. A week here, gardening, maintaining the property. A domestic arrangement. Something lodges in her throat. The soda tastes metallic. She tells herself to stay. She plays the part. Asks questions. Smiles politely. At one point, he excuses himself and goes to the bathroom, and the moment the door closes, she sees, mounted under the edge of the loft, a compact camera wedged tight beneath a beam. Its lens is aimed toward the bed, where visitors would sleep. It is small, coated in dust, but for the glass, where someone had wiped a thumb impression recently. She leaves her cup on the counter like a prop and walks to the car. The man is on the porch by the time she starts the engine. He smiles and calls her name. She speeds away. According to the woman, police later confirmed the camera had been recording and that the footage included other women who had come and left the cabin. One officer told her, "We couldn't say definitively who those women were," and the language of uncertainty clashed with the raw certainty she felt in her stomach. He was arrested months later, according to public records she says she saw. The charges listed in a local blotter, she adds, were related to voyeurism and trespass, but she cautions that some counts were listed as alleged while the legal process continued. Whether he had used that cabin methodically, she doesn't state as a verdict, only as the pattern she found. Years after, she still checks for cameras in any place she's asked to meet alone. She has an app on her phone now that detects hidden lenses. She angles the phone camera into corners and listens for a tiny mechanical whine that most people would not notice. The idea that a small device could make a private moment into evidence is what bothers her, not the device itself, but the intention that sits behind it. In these versions, the meeting unfolds in a cabin off a back road, she told me. The original account she had read named other types of buildings as meeting points. Here, that tripod under the loft beam becomes the same violation. Private space recorded without permission, a small lens hiding under a roof shadow. The fallout changes how she answers the phone. She refuses rides from strangers. She keeps her schedule compact and public. For her, freedom becomes a sequence of checks and calculations. Between the binder and the camera, a theme forms. Abandoned timber frames are not always repositories of time. Sometimes they are active labs, places where surveillance is set up, where lists are compiled, where strangers are cataloged. I didn't move on. I kept asking others if they'd felt the same shiver in the base of their necks when they entered a cabin. The answers came in the form of stories. One came from two sisters, Claire and Jenna, who bought a weekend place because it was cheap. In papers, it had been called a fixer-upper. To them, it was an escape.
They imagined weekends of hauling lumber and painting and cheap takeout on the porch. What they discovered was sound. Their first nights were restless, but not alarming. Settling timber, the house breathing. It was a cabin with a loft. On the second night, Claire wakes to the sound of soft thuds above her. She assumes it's a raccoon or a loose shutter. The second night, the footsteps are heavier, shuffling, near the ridge of the ceiling. They go up one afternoon with a flashlight and find a hidden space, a hatch nailed up that someone had opened recently. Inside the loft is a small mattress, rotting fabric, a few jars with labels. There are clothes that don't belong to them, a diary missing several pages, and a thermos that still holds a faint, oil-tinged scent. It smells of someone who had tried to live here without being seen. Nightfall brings the footsteps back, but now they are not just aerial noises, they are purposeful. The clutch of nails in the stair creak like someone approaching. One night, a heavy weight bangs against a bedroom door as Claire sleeps. The sisters barricade themselves in, calling their neighbor. When the neighbor comes with a flashlight, they find the latch forced, but no one inside. Only a scrap of shirt snagged on the jamb, and muddy prints trailing back toward the woods. They later learn, via a neighbor who was prone to gossip, that a reclusive man had lived on the property years before, and that he had a record of trespass and odd behavior. Reports, according to what they were told, that labeled him as potentially dangerous. Whether he had used the loft to hide or had been using the cabin to spy on passers-by was never conclusively proven. The sisters describe it as a possibility, in the way someone might describe a leak in a roof. Known, suspected, but not fully documented. They move out within weeks. It felt like someone else's life had been left under our bed, Jenna told me. They sell the place. Claire still wakes sometimes when a floorboard sounds the way that door did the night it banged. The terror in the sisters' tale isn't the attic itself, but the sense that someone had nested there, that the cabin's hollow heart had been used to watch them back.
a private space made into another's hiding place. That motif, an ordinary shelter turned repository for secrets, threads through nearly every account I collected. It is small details that make it visceral. The rusted nail that stuck the page of a photo album, the chemical tang of cleaning fluid on a kitchen counter suggesting someone scrubbed evidence, a child's coloring page folded and tucked under a mattress so that no one would find it easily. I heard from a babysitter named Maria who took a job in an isolated rental near a state park, adapted here into a cabin with a gravel drive and a stand of pines. She was young, responsible, and had been hired by a family who thought a weekend away at a friend's cabin would be safe.
The parents left with a cool parental confidence and the promise to be back at midnight. By 3 in the morning, the little girl she was watching, whom we'll call Bella to protect identity, wakes up and cries out for a drink. Maria opens the back door and looks out into moonlit trees to fetch water from the picnic cooler. A figure stands near the tree line, unnaturally still. Maria freezes. The man is peering through the window, his face half hidden by shadow, holding a hand to his mouth like someone imitating a muzzle. She watches as he taps the glass with his knuckles, soft and deliberate. She slams the door and locks it, knees knocking so hard she feels them in her veins. The bang of fists on wood comes a minute later, urgent, panicked. The sun is not supposed to rise for hours. She calls 911 with a man at the door pressed between her teeth. The dispatcher says they will send someone, but it will take time. She throws a child's blanket over Bella, keeps her voice low, and tells the little girl a story about a witch who can't find her house because it's not on any map. It is absurd, but it buys time. Through the door she hears a voice, muffled, asking for help. Then louder. A man's grunt, as if trying the knob. He grows louder, childish, like someone who thinks banging will work. By the time headlights sweep across the yard, a police cruiser, according to what she later reported, the man has left. An officer takes statements. They search the grounds and find a shallow bivouac under some brush, a sleeping bag, an empty thermos, a hoodie. The fabric fibers match fibers found on the porch where the banging had worn the paint away. Maria insists the experience changes her. She will never, she says, be unprepared for the possibility of a stranger at the latch again. Police records list a transient man found wandering in the area that night. But Maria is careful to say allegedly when she recounts the exchange. She doesn't want to label the man conclusively. Legal claims and their outcomes are messy, she knows. The personal effect, however, is sharp and immediate. She no longer babysits beyond town limits. She sleeps with a lamp on for months. After each of these accounts, a pattern emerges. An ordinary plan, meet, interview, stay the weekend, curdles into a near violation. The cabin, which might once have been a neutral backdrop for a movie's nostalgic scene, is never neutral again. A porch swing becomes a vantage point. A loft becomes a blind. A cellar door becomes an entrance to secrets. You might be thinking that these are separate acts by separate people, coincidence sewn into rural backgrounds. But then you get a story that threads the evidence together. Ben and his friend Dylan were urbex and had a small following online. They pried open locks with practiced ease and made content about the myths of abandoned places. They were careful where they thought they were. They went into one cabin at the edge of a decommissioned property because their viewers had asked, "What's inside the house that the cops burned out years ago?" Their footage starts casual, laughing knocks, a flashlight beam dancing across wallpaper. Then the mood changes when one of them points at a wall covered in newspaper clippings. The camera jitters as Ben whispers that some of the clippings are about missing persons. They split up. Dylan goes toward the back where there's a collapsed stair to a basement. Ben takes the loft to film overhead shots. The ladder creaks. He hears movement below. He pans the lens and finds rope coils, plastic ties, and a jumble of dental floss tangled with twine. The sound of nylon on wood is so ordinary, it becomes monstrous to him in that moment. Downstairs, Dylan hears the shuffle of someone else. He calls out. There's no answer. Then footfalls that do not belong to either of them. The porch door slams. The camera catches a shadow crossing the threshold, and then the two men see a silhouette, someone moving with a graceless urgency. The intruder smiles, or his mouth makes a shape like a smile, and then runs. They run faster. They record a breathless, blurred chase across wet leaves. They hear laughter that is too close, not at all disembodied. Eventually, they scramble into a truck and drive away, their footage smudged with panic. They post the clip the next night with a caption asking the audience to identify the figure. People speculate online.
Some call it a squatter. Others say it looks like someone who wanted to scare them. For Ben, the discovery of makeshift bedding and the personal items, an old map with cities ringed in red, a small journal with initials, felt like stumbling into another person's life set up inside a forgotten framing. He says the most unnerving part was the way the cabin had been adapted to be used by someone who wanted to stay hidden, but also perhaps watch. Cameras, lists, lofts used for hiding, these are the practical items. But then there are the things that aren't easy to fit into a police report. The feeling of being seen through the grain of wood, the sudden, disproportionate anxiety that takes up a permanent residence in a survivor's chest. One of the shorter accounts came from a camping trip. Anna and her friends pitched tents near a long, empty cabin, drawn by the myth that the place was haunted. Around midnight, a scream slices the dark, a human, ragged, not like the hoot of a distant owl. Headlamps cut through pine trunks and illuminate a figure staggering near the tree line. A truck idles in the distance, then speeds away. They say the sound won't leave them. For weeks, they jump at brakes and door swarms. What ties these vignettes are small artifacts, a child's crayon drawing shoved under floorboards, a laminated list of names, a camera tucked under the eaves, a rope stored behind a stove. Each item proves agency.
They speak, someone came here intentionally, someone prepared to watch, to wait, to store. Here's the thing with evidence. It does not have to be violent to be criminal. A list can be as guilty as a weapon when it catalogs people. A camera can violate with the relentlessness of 1,000 tiny eyes. A bed in a loft becomes a sleeping place and a watchtower. The cabins were shells, and they became infrastructure, quiet, wooden infrastructure for shameful intentions. The stories keep piling up, and by the time you reach the 6th or 7th, the pattern has taken on its own weight. I'm telling you these not because each is spectacular on its own, but because each is ordinary enough to be terrifying. An old cabin on a map can hide a binder. A binder can yield a roster. A roster can point to people who should be sleeping safe. There's an adjusted cadence to these accounts. The panic was always immediate, present tense, raw, the heart in the throat when the door slams. The aftermath is patient, past tense, where the wound is measured in nights without sleep and in relationships rearranged. Survivors go on. They take precautions. They change numbers and routes. They pick up therapy, or they learn a new ritual of checking under beds and shining phones into corners. But not all of them are cautionary tales that end in safety. Some of the worst moments are those that stop halfway, the ones where a scream is heard and a light swings over a scene you are forbidden from finishing. Those moments insist on continuity, on the knowledge that something unresolved is still out there. I want to tell you one more story for this part, one that ends in a movement forward rather than a settled conclusion. It began with a call in the dead of winter to a man named Aaron, a part-time security guard who checked old properties at night. People like Aaron are often the unsung last line between what is private and what is abandoned. He tells me he took the job because it paid, but also because there is a job satisfaction in keeping watch. The cabin he was assigned that month had been burned years before. Charred boards still leaned at angles like crooked teeth. It sat alone on a low plane, and when the wind blew across it, it sounded like a dry sigh. One night, walking the perimeter, Aaron saw a figure moving inside through a gap in a broken window. He radioed control. He did not enter at first. The voice on the other end told him to wait. He crept closer. The window frame cut his glove with a splinter. He saw a flicker of motion in the basement opening and something heavy lowered into shadow. He calls in backup and waits, but time is stubborn. The figure inside moves with purpose. At a certain point, he decides he cannot wait. He climbs in through the broken fenestration and goes down. The stairs are slick with ash. What he found, according to his statements, which later appear in a police blotter that lists undisclosed findings, was not what he expected.
There was a reinforced hatch, a chain, and beyond it a chamber carved under the floor where voices could be heard muffled and urgent. He says his gut told him there were people down there. The memory of the scream he answered on a different radio channel the month before was suddenly relevant in a way he hadn't predicted. He calls for assistance, and the response is a chaotic radio feed of movement, sirens, shouted coordinates, the clatter of boots. When officers finally pry the hatch, the light reveals people, alive, frightened, bound with cloth and wire. They are rescued and taken from the basement, and the men in the shadows try to escape, but are apprehended. That rescue, the one Aaron says left a ringing in his head for months afterward, was the moment that made many of the other small discoveries add up to something that could be called a network. But network is a charged word. Aaron and others are careful with such terms. He said, "It looked organized to me," but he also admitted that he could not, from the single cabin, speak to a broader reach.
The police at the time referred to the discovery as an active rescue and noted that multiple suspects were detained, though he stresses that some things remained allegedly and others later went unproven in court documents, he glimpsed. For the families of those rescued, the cabin is an origin of both trauma and salvation, proof that the worst can sometimes be interrupted. For Aaron, the sight of people in that cellar is both a relief and a burden carried in the chest. He says he dreams of anchors and of being unable to move. This is where I'm going to pause, not because the story concludes neatly, far from it, but because the terrain shifts from discovery into aftermath and investigation, and that part is dense. The rest of the accounts I gathered circle back to that darkened hatch, to the way cabin rafters hide cameras, and the way floorboards can conceal lists. They also widen the lens to consider who constructs these spaces and why. There are still vignettes I haven't told, a hooded figure near graves that turns out to be someone following a path neither holy nor harmless, a group of teens who look up from a tent and find the shadow of a body pass across the ground, the moment someone finds a child's drawing pinned to a wall in a place not meant for children. Each of those scenes accumulates detail, smells of mildew and old tobacco, the grit of ash in an upturned sink, the click of an old reel-to-reel tape player that someone used once and never stopped setting down, and each one points to the same uncomfortable idea. Abandoned cabins are useful to people who wish to remove themselves from notice. In the next part, I will walk through the discovery that tied many of these small pieces to a larger machine, the place where personal items and lists and camera footage intersected.
We'll go further into the effects on the survivors, the nightmares, the legal ambiguity, the ways the evidence was handled and mishandled. We'll revisit the sisters and the Urbex duo and the guard, and we will follow the trail where it leads, into official records, into court dockets that say indefinito in places that matter the most, and into the quiet, human aftermath that doesn't fit neatly into headlines. For now, hold the image of a rotting floorboard, pried up to reveal a photograph with a face you recognize. Hold the sound of heavy thuds above a ceiling that should be empty. Hold the knowledge that paper can be as dangerous as a weapon because it maps people like prey. Investigators moved slowly at first because that's how bureaucracy and caution intersect. Boxes cataloged, warrants drafted, pages numbered in quiet rooms beneath fluorescent lights. But even slow work can move with purpose, and the small artifacts pulled from the first cabin began to hum when put next to what came from others. A laminated roster from the clearing cabin, a Polaroid with a porch number that matched a postcard found under a mattress in another place, an angle of shot notation scrawled beside a camera lens, minutiae that when stitched together hinted at deliberate repetition rather than random acts. According to a detective I spoke with, he asked his name not be used, the first tangible lead came from a torn receipt found in a storage locker tied to one of the burned cabins. The receipt had an address for a mail service and a partial name. The attendant remembered a man who'd frequently rented boxes and paid in cash. The handwriting on a scrap, when compared to the phone number that had called Matt at 2 a.m, suggested a match. He told me with professional reserve that it wasn't conclusive, but in their line of work, confluence is as useful as certainty. Patterns are the thing that builds cases. They followed the pattern, cabin to cabin, locker to locker, an online handle here, a shipping label there. In another unit, they found a stack of labeled VHS tapes and a zippered binder of Polaroids. In a plywood drawer, someone had kept the kinds of ordinary objects that become terrifying when placed in context. A child's crayon drawing folded into a corner, a grocery list with a few names scribbled at the bottom, generic hotel keycards with dates circled. According to police logs I reviewed, technicians cataloged reels and images, slowly scanning analog footage into digital files that would later be mined for faces and locations. When pressed on the question of scale, the detective said, "We had to treat each cabin as both a crime scene and a crime scene in potential." He used the word potential often. It was the hedging language of an institution that must not overreach. Still, he admitted to feeling the same horizontal cold that runs through the survivors' reports, the sense that a map drawn in pen could guide real harm. Paper, he told me, is a kind of architecture. Not all the items found were dramatic. Some were functional in the way of isolate and observe. Cheap camping lanterns with long battery life, a set of spare lenses in a padded case, a roll of black electrical tape with a small notch missing where it had been used to silence a switch. Other finds were intimate and small, a mitten with a child's name sewn into the cuff, a napkin with a phone number and the initials LH scratched into the lower corner. Each one was treated and scored, bagged and labeled, numbered evidence tags fluttering like a grim inventory. But paperwork and tags don't translate easily into courtroom narratives, and many of the legal files I skimmed through contained the soft word indefinido, where outcomes remained murky. Allegations sat side by side with unclear chain of custody notes, and some video, because of its age and degradation, could not provide facial recognition strong enough to prosecute. One attorney who reviewed the evidence for defense said, "In a lot of these cases, you can show proximity and pattern, but attribution, who did what with which intent, that's the hard part." That legal opacity had consequences. Survivors were confronted with the dual frustration of exposure to a threat and exposure to the legal system's slow machinery. Matt, who had found the binder and moved into a different city, told me that while charges were opened, according to police, much of the inquiry stalled when items couldn't be decisively tied to a named defendant. He described the period after his discovery as an in-between life, recognizable rhythms of day-to-day obligations, but punctuated by a constant recalibration of what alone meant. He chose a therapist who specialized in trauma, and he learned to label the physiological signs of panic, shallow breaths, a tightening jaw, before they consumed him. He learned mitigation techniques. He sleeps with a white noise machine and keeps emergency contacts keyed into a speed dial. "In the shelter of that new apartment, though," he said, "I still start at the sound of a thud, the way some people flinch at a car backfiring. You don't get to trade back that awareness." The stories that followed the exposures were as varied as the cabins themselves. There were survivors who carried guilt like a smudge. They blamed themselves for not leaving earlier, for not noticing a camera angle, for taking a side road alone at night. The counselors I spoke with emphasized that survivor blame is a social reflex, not a moral truth. The accounts show that predators, when they exist, rely on ordinary behaviors: trust, courtesy, a desire to help. Transforming those routines into defenses was not a failure. It was an adaptation to a landscape that had changed. At the same time, some of the most vivid connective tissue between the cabins came not from police, but from online communities.
Early on, a loose network of explorers and concerned locals formed a digital thread where people posted coordinates, grainy images, and warnings. Sometimes the channel served as a public service. Don't go near the West Hollow cabin, it's rigged. Other times, it amplified rumor. Somebody would post a Polaroid and ask, "Who is this?" And dozens of strangers would respond with speculation, some helpful, others predatory in their attention. The Urbex community, particularly, was ambivalent. Ben told me that after his run-in, he felt both violated and implicated, complicit in his own danger because of the videos he posted that attracted eyes. He wrestled with the ethics of showing places that are, in effect, vulnerable to misuse. "We were trying to show decay and story," he said, "but we didn't anticipate that the story would be used as a blueprint." He and Dylan stopped posting for a while. They deleted older videos that revealed interior angles and close-ups of certain cabins. Their decision wasn't about guilt as much as it was about responsibility, how to narrate spaces without handing instructions over to someone with ill intent. Between the lockers and the digital channels, a new pattern emerged, a set of individuals who seemed to reappear in the margins of multiple cabins' lives. It was never clean or simple evidence, more an accumulation of impressions. A handle used on a forum that had been active under different emails, a rental contract where a man signed with a nickname, a thermal jacket left in one cabin that matched a jacket photographed at another site. Police, constrained by legal thresholds, labeled certain connections as indicative of possible coordination. To many survivors, possible felt very close to real. That fear of coordination produced its own ripple effects in communities near abandoned timberlands. Neighbors began to talk in different tones. Where once they traded apples and carpentry tips, they now circulated photocopies of itemized inventory lists from evidence files. Neighborhood watches sprang up around state parks. People installed motion lights and trail cameras and shared the footage in private groups. More than one congregational leader began to include practical safety in sermons, checking in, traveling in pairs, telling someone where you're going. A small town near one stretch of cabins held a meeting in a church basement, where survivors and police sat on opposite sides of folding tables and tried to explain their responsibilities to each other. And then there was the question of children. Several of the items retrieved from cabins, a coloring page, a tiny mitten, a child's name written in crayon, made those meetings hushed. People wanted clear answers about whether minors had been targeted. The answer invariably slid into the hedged language of belief and possibility. "We have some materials that indicate the presence of children at certain times," a social worker told me.
But proving intentional targeting is very complicated. The presence of children's items in a place used for living does not by itself indicate the worst. Still, for parents in the vicinity, those artifacts functioned like an injection of pure dread. The ways that ordinary parenting routines could intersect with danger, sleepovers at cabins, parents dropping kids off for brief periods, suddenly felt like risk matrices. Families adjusted. Not every anomaly led to criminal indictment. Some cabins were simply homes that had been occupied by the unhoused, people living in a stray way, leaving behind a mess that cataloged only their necessity. Other times, people used cabins to escape and were not preying on anyone. The nuance mattered, and the survivors I talked to were aware of it. Most wanted accountability and clarity, but they resisted an easy collapse into paranoia because they knew that not every dark window harbored malice. Yet other moments were less ambiguous. One sequence, pieced together from interviews, lab logs, and a series of redacted incident reports, stands out. Footage recovered from one cabin that showed multiple women arriving and leaving at times consistent with names found on a laminated list. The film was grainy, faces mostly turned away, but the pattern of entrances and exits, the angles of the camera, and the consistency of certain actors in the footage produced enough cause for follow-up inquiries. A patrol found items at a different site that matched outfits seen in the footage. Detectives compared boot treads and stitch patterns. Each small tie strengthened the sense that there had been planning. Even with such evidence, the legal story unfolded slowly and with compromises. Warrants were served, people were interviewed. Some suspects were detained, some were released with probation, others had cases dismissed or prolonged and labeled indefinio in court transcripts that spiraled into appeals and motions. A prosecutor, when asked about the challenges of building a case on dispersed physical artifacts, spoke of needing a narrative that holds up. That narrative must explain intent, presence, and method. Paper helps, but it is rarely decisive alone. Meanwhile, the survivors kept living. Jenna, one of the sisters who had sold the cabin after footsteps in the loft, moved to a duplex in town. She told me that part of her recovery was practical and small. She filled the sounds of the night with a radio tuned to a morning show and learned to identify the station's jingles like an anchor. She also installed a simple attic sensor that triggers if someone steps on the roof. It made her feel less helpless. For Claire, therapy was less about tools and more about undoing the belief that the world had been literally rewritten. I had to teach my gut new maps, she said. Maps where my house doesn't belong to someone else. There were, of course, residual cultural shifts.
Real estate agents noticed interest in properties with certain features: solid locks, visible neighbors, short driveways. People started asking more questions in listings. Has the property been used for anything other than habitation? Is there a history of trespass? Cabin owners grouped into WhatsApp chains to alert each other of strangers seen near well-known abandoned sites. The fear migrated into practice. In the middle of these bureaucratic and domestic adjustments, a few stories remained unresolved and therefore lingered longer in people's minds. One involved the hooded figure near the cemetery, adapted here to a decaying chapel cabin near an old burial ground. A group of teens, daring each other beyond midnight, slipped into the overgrown path and found a figure crouched inside a mausoleum-shaped outbuilding. They ran. One of them, Jay, tripped and felt fingers in the dirt, panting that sounded like someone laughing close by. They reported it to local police, who found no immediate evidence. Months later, during a separate sweep of cabins tied to other leads, officers found a hooded sweatshirt matching fabric samples the teens described. It wasn't enough for charges. It was enough to make Jay stop walking the cemetery path at dusk. In an account bordering on the surreal, Anna, the camper who'd heard the scream, re-examined her footage with fresh eyes weeks after the incident. On night vision, in a split-second frame, there seemed to be an object tied to a tree, something fluttering in the breeze. She emailed the clip to a regional 3-person task force that had been formed by volunteers, retired officers, a forensic enthusiast, and a local attorney. They wrote back that the object looked like a cloth ribbon, possibly a marker. It was a small observation, but it connected to a recurring practice investigators had found in multiple cabins. Certain symbols, often simple and personal, used as markers. Initials carved into beams, a red thread tied around a nail, a coin taped beneath a floorboard. These markers were less about occultism than about ownership, a way some people mark private spaces to themselves. To survivors, however, markers read as threats. Without definitive answers, some survivors found community to be the only form of closure. They started informal support circles that met in town halls and coffee shops. In one meeting I listened to, 3 women in their 20s traded techniques for scanning rooms: how to angle a phone camera into corners, what apps can pick up microcameras, where to look for mounting screws near beams.
The tone was practical but not flippant. They wanted rituals that enacted safety. It was, in another sense, a reclaiming of space, turning fear into procedure. Tech solutions proliferated as well. There are now low-cost lens detection devices that hum under a phone app. There are motion-activated lights and portable door jammers that can keep a knob from turning even if someone tries.
The sales spikes were measurable. Local hardware stores in several towns near the cabins reported increased purchases of heavy-duty deadbolts, metal window bars, and laminated window film. Survivors used those purchases to translate trauma into a tangible buffer. But not all pain could be smoothed by lock and light. Aaron, the security guard who had found the cellar and whose rescue still sat raw in his memory, told me that recovery was less about hardware than about the images that lodged in him. You go down there expecting to stop something simple, he said, and you find that you don't get to be a hero in a movie. You get to become a witness. Witnessing is its own punishment sometimes. He sought counseling through an employee assistance program and found hours of sleep were now divided by recurring dreams where he couldn't move his legs. He quit that security post in the end, took a daytime job, and said, "You try to step out of the shadow, but you take the weight with you." There were moments, too, where intervention worked in the most direct way. A door forced open at the right time, a neighbor's random walk home that interrupted an attempted entry, a camper's scream that summoned a searchlight. Those flashes of response, ordinary civic acts, saved people in more than one account. The rescued victims from the cellar were, according to social services reports, experiencing a complex range of outcomes. Some engaged with emergency counseling, others returned to family members out of state, and a few declined services altogether. They had written statements in the files, recanted and revised, sometimes confused, often exhausted. The files read like lives being reassembled with expert hands. Even with rescues and prosecutions, the aftershocks radiated. A woman who had been recorded in the caretaker cabin footage told me it took her a long time to reclaim the word date. She dated cautiously afterward, with metered disclosures and meetups in crowded public places. The Urbexers, Ben and Dylan, turned their channel into a safety project, hosting episodes on how to inspect a space without giving away interior angles, a kind of harm reduction. They still explored, but with a different posture, less sensational, more watchful. Their audience diminished, but the subscribers who stayed were those who appreciated candor and caution. What unsettled many was that the cabins made visible something that had always been possible, the theft of privacy using banal tools. An old lens, a stapled roster, a child's drawing tucked away. These are not cinematic props, they're instruments. They have a quiet efficiency. They require no moneyed sophistication to be used with devastating effect. The materials that power fear are cheap. That fact made a lot of people feel, in the way only a precise threat can, profoundly exposed.
As months passed, some of the more made-of-paper evidence, lists, rosters, and logbooks, began to circulate in redacted forms among journalists, each with their own ethics. Some outlets printed blurred photographs and anonymized entries. Others refused to reprint items at all. Survivors complained about re-exposure. Police, for their part, tightened requests for media access. The legal tug-of-war over sensitive evidence played out publicly enough to generate debate about privacy, the public interest in disclosure, and the harm of sensationalism. A regional editor told me, "We owe survivors restraint, and we owe the public clarity. Sometimes those two obligations are at odds." Behind the policy debates, the human stories continued. I heard from an EMT who delivered a child to a hospital after a frightened babysitter, many months after the initial spate of discoveries, called in with the same pounding knock scenario. The EMT said the caregiver was shaking like a leaf, and that her hands didn't stop moving long after the incident. Panic becomes habit for some people, he told me. You can't always snap out of a response that's kept you alive. And then there were the nights when nothing seemed to happen, quiet yards and boarded windows, and those nights were perhaps the cruelest. They reminded survivors that not every fear is met by action, and not every suspicion is answered by evidence. That limbo is heavy. By the time public attention dimmed, the physical traces of these cabins started to disappear. Some were looted or burned beyond recognition. Others were rehabilitated and sold. But the psychological footprint stayed. People moved. They learned new checks. They spread knowledge about how to peer under eaves and inspect loft brackets. They taught their children small rituals, to tell an adult before going near a gray cabin, to take a buddy and leave a route plan. Rituals both practical and symbolic took root, and in those rituals survivors found a modicum of control. If there is a moral to all of this, it is not tidy. There is no single villain neatly apprehended in every file. There is a cluster of small human practices, surveillance, secrecy, itinerancy, that when deployed together, create conditions where hidden harms can thrive. The cabin is a metaphor for that confluence, an innocuous frame that, in skillful hands, can be rearranged into a tool. In the last months of my inquiries, I revisited several of the people who had shared their stories earlier.
Matt had remarried, cautiously, to someone who loved dogs and mornings. He said with a modest smile that he could let the blinds fall dark during the day without looking over his shoulder. Claire and Jenna had lost contact with a neighbor who used to bring over pies. Sometimes people leave, they said, and you keep living anyway. Maria, the babysitter, took a job inside city limits and no longer works overnight.
Ben and Dylan made a modest documentary about safety that toured community centers. Aaron, the guard, organizes volunteers for a church-run night walk patrol and has, in small acts, sought to remoralize his own sense of purpose. And then there is the final image I'll ask you to hold, a simple, stubborn one. Picture a rotting floorboard pried up by someone who thinks they'll find mice or old newspapers, only to see the corner of a photograph, edges browned, the face fuzzy with age. Someone at that moment realizes that what they've taken for decay is not neutral. They fold it, place it in a plastic evidence bag, and feel the sudden, extraordinary weight of another life. These histories don't end with closure. They end with changes that accumulate. Locks switched, phones set to emergency contacts, kids taught to come home before dark. They end with lists that are cataloged and sometimes prosecuted, and often not. They end with survivors who learn to live with an awareness that the world is not entirely safe. Those are not dramatic endings, and they are not satisfying in the way a courthouse finale would be, but they are truthful to what happened. So what do you do with a story like this? How do you let it live in your head without letting it transform you into someone who never goes outside? The balance, survivors said in various ways, is to practice guardedness, not paranoia, to learn practical steps without changing the meaning of your life. To lock doors, yes, but not to stop opening them forever. If this rattled you, share it with someone who needs to hear these warnings. Subscribe for more first-person accounts and investigations like these. And one more small, practical thing. If you ever find yourself inside an old cabin, respect the law, bring a friend, let someone know where you are, and check corners and lofts before you sit. Be careful, yes. Be human, too. Tonight, before you close this video, imagine one more image. A lamplight thrown across a dusty table, revealing a laminated sheet with names written in columns, the neat, methodical hand of something planned. Then imagine lifting that sheet and seeing beneath it a child's crayon drawing folded like a secret. The two things together are what we found in abandoned cabins, evidence of organization and fragments of ordinary life, interleaved until we cannot tell the difference. What they found will not be easily forgotten. Neither should it be.